This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. Some stakes are redeemable, others are less so. I think this might be a redeemable, but this is a partscaster that I put together in 2016, and today I wanted to talk about the story of it, what I've learned from it, and maybe if you're considering building a partscaster, you could get some tips from this, or let other folks know in the comments where you think really good places to get parts are for partscasters, and any sort of tips that you might have, good resources. So 2016, I've just built my white Twattercaster. This one actually, in some ways, ended up being a bit tidier. One way was at the top here, this decal, which you can probably see is actually a little bit tidier than what I managed to achieve on the Telly headstock. This is obviously my second guitar that I made. Also, the main thing was that on the Telly I had already kind of finished the headstock, and then I decided, right, I'll try and take off this and put this back on. So it was a whole sort of cluster F. Earvarna nut. Quite like these because you don't really have to do too much with them. They're like compensated nuts. It's a Warmoth neck with stainless frets. That is one thing that the stainless frets I think are a benefit. It ended up with Fender Abbey initialed, I think 69s or something like that. It was a loaded scratch plate, so I didn't have to do any soldering. And here's a weak point. I think you'll probably see the body is kind of messy. Yeah. And then here's another issue, which is that the neck is actually a boat neck, which I wouldn't really recommend. It's like a really aggressive V, as you can see, thick at the bottom. So I guess we could talk about it a little bit more, but those are some of the key things. So, as I said, it was a Warmoth neck. So, I think at the time, and still even, Warmoth are probably one of the pretty decent options. The thing that I did, which, I didn't have any of the money at the time, just the year before I decided to quit my job to pursue music as a career, which I've done a video on recently. And there was a sale on, I think, with Warmoth. And no wonder the boat necks, it's like a really aggressive V at the bottom. It does smooth out to be quite comfortable, but at the bottom here you've got like an inch, sort of like the old Telly necks, kind of. Sort of comfortable in some ways, but also not so comfortable in others. Yeah, it's like a vintage spec 7.25 inch radius, which I don't mind, but with stainless steel frets. Now I think some of those specs work quite nicely for me. The stainless fret's great, and the fretwork is really tidy, so I would recommend that. As much as I've not played it tons and tons and tons, I have gigged it. I would expect some fretwear at this point, but there isn't really any to speak of, and that is like the benefit of stainless frets, right? So where were some of the mistakes that I made? One, I think I should have probably spec'd this hardware here. So this is a strap, obviously not a telly. The thing about a telly bridge is it doesn't have as many moving parts as a strap bridge, right? So even this area here, and I do have a spare actually. I have another parts guitar, which went potentially worse in some ways than this even. So I think I would opt, if I was going to build a strap type parts caster again, go for a more expensive bridge would be my recommendation. So K-Line use a Wilkinson trem. I do have a spare Wilkinson trem. That might be the way that I would go. You know, if it's good enough for a K-Line, then it's good enough for this. The cool thing about the Wilkinson trems as well is that they have a push-in arm, so it's really useful for that without doing the screwy-uppy stuff. So I would do that. These pickups are kind of low output, kind of, I don't know, it's a bit difficult to tell the tone at the moment because I've got 8-gauge strings on it, because I did this as an experiment. And the other area that so this was the first time that I tried nitro, because the warm-off necks, basically, they come unfinished at the cheapest end. So that might be another thing I would say, just go for a slightly more expensive warm-off neck if you're going to buy one that already has the finish on, because chances are, unless you know what you're doing with this stuff, this will be like your first go trying to finish a neck. And that doesn't really make too much sense in my mind. Yeah, well, it makes sense because it's like gives you something to learn, like how these guitars are made together. But basically, finishing a neck in nitro is not super easy at all. Like, there's skill involved with it, obviously, and that's why, you know, we pay money for guitars that have a decent finish off. So I used like spray nitro that I got from, I think, like Manchester Guitar Tech or something like that online, and it kind of went on okay. Like, the neck feels pretty comfortable, and then, you know, obviously you sand it down. But the negative with it is that it sort of crept round onto the fretboard in some places. I think maybe partly because of the V, but basically it's kind of gone like that. And so there's bits of nitro on the fretboard. Now, that would clean and scrape off if I had spent more time on it. And I could still do that, I guess. The guitar is lightweight, which is a real good thing. I think these plastics look kind of crap as well. But in general, like, I have gigged this guitar. I took this to, I did a residency in a hotel in 2016. This came along for the ride with a Fender vintage hot rod telly, the Nashville type telly. The body, by the way, is finished. So basically it's swamp ash, or just ash. And then you grain fill it with Gecko Fill grain filler, and then you basically scrape that off with a credit card. I saw all this sort of stuff on the TDPRI forum. I think there was lots of stuff about, you know, building barn casters. I guess is kind of the inspiration for this. And then you sort of sand it back. All of this tough stuff takes loads of time, by the way. Sand it back, but leave like a fairly rough job of it, so that it's still like doing this stuff. This is kind of the first pass of it, whereas this on top, I actually put another bit of white pigment on top. So basically, you'll see that's where like a lot of the pigment has kind of left the body, because it kind of just leaks out over time. So yeah, you sand it back so that it's kind of showing the grain, but also for me, I kind of liked it being pretty rough. And then put white pigment on top of that, and then fill it with basically like a Danish oil. If I was doing it again, I would probably use like a white blonde nitro. That would be where I'd go if I was to do this sort of thing again. These pickups, I'm not sure they do too much for me, so at some stage I might consider whether I replace those with like a lot of dirty blonde or something like that, because actually I do think it plays quite well. Like, I don't know, the thing about it is with a parts caster, you don't really know what's going to happen until it's done. And you might end up with something that might be like playing like about as well as a Squire, or you might end up with something that's really fantastic, but it kind of, you don't really know until you put it together. It's kind of one of the risks of it, and it's always going to be quite difficult to get back as much money and time as you put into it. I do prefer the telly that I made to this one, but as I say, this is a bit tidier on the headstock. The neck is, you know, not necessarily my first choice of neck style, but it doesn't get uncomfortable when playing it, so that's kind of a cool thing. What do you think of it? How do you think it sounds? Have you ever tried making a parts caster? As I say, leave some comments if you have some tips for folks that are considering maybe doing this sort of thing. I would say doing one of these at least in your lifetime is like a good learning experience to see, you know, what guitars like this are like to put together. I'm not saying that this is what it's like to put together like a really boutique, posh guitar or anything, but, you know, putting together parts casters like a Strat, like a Telly, is something that I think we should all have a go at doing, just so that we know what it's like, maybe. And then it makes you appreciate like really well put together guitars all the more, I think. I'll catch you in another video soon. That's my Twattercaster number 2 from 2016, warm-off neck. Well, actually, guitar build. I think that was where it's from. Yeah, and then a scratch bait. I'm gonna, I think, upgrade that bridge to a Wilkinson. Maybe then I'll play this guitar more.